So welcome to Groves and GLO. We are so excited to have you all here today for a very special presentation by three members of our GLO team. Before we get started, I'd love to introduce myself and let you know about some of the opportunities that we have coming up for families to engage with GLO. And then I'll introduce our presenters and review just a few housekeeping items. So I am Nancy Segreti. I'm our Director of Growth and Enrollment at GLO. And I have the great honor of working alongside our teams of professionals in our Learning Center and our admissions and enrollment departments. So we have a few upcoming opportunities to engage with GLO and learn more about our programming that I wanted to share with you all today. So number one, we have an open house for Groves Academy coming up on February 7th at 9 a.m. You can register on our website. You can also just join us that day. This is a really great opportunity to learn more about Groves Academy, take a tour, see our newly renovated lower school, meet school leadership, and most importantly, hear from some of our current parents and students about their experience at Groves. It's a really special and fun event. We'd love to have you there. Number two, we also have a virtual informational session for our Groves summer programs coming up on Thursday, February 15th at noon. And this is a really nice opportunity to learn more about our summer program experience and the application process, which is now open. We do have an early bird registration special for our summer program, and that ends on February 9th. So if you would like to connect with our team prior to the early bird and prior to that informational session, please reach out to us directly. We would love to schedule a call with you. You do need to register for that event online so that you can get a registration link for that webinar. And three, we're going to be hosting a series of these educational workshops just like today throughout this school year and into next year. So stay tuned on our GLO website for upcoming topics and dates. And of course, we'd love to hear from you if you have any specific topics you would like to see on that calendar. So we're almost there. A few housekeeping items. So to help us stay on schedule, your camera and microphone have been turned off. Our panel of presenters will present, and then we'll take some questions at the end. So when it's time for questions, you'll see me again, and you're going to use that chat function to submit your questions, and I'll moderate. We have a fairly large group today, so we probably won't get to every question, but we will do our best. And the presenters will be going over some resources and sharing some links for you. And so you will be getting the slides with those links and resources after the presentation. So don't feel like you have to feverishly write everything down. Now, I am very, very pleased to introduce our panel. So first, we have Meghan Miller, who is our Director of Individualized Programs at GLO, which includes our speech language and tutoring departments, as well as our summer programs. Meghan is a speech language pathologist and an ADHD certified educator. Second, we have DeeDee Clendenning. She is a speech language pathologist and ADHD certified educator on our team at GLO. And third, we have Dr. Marla Martin, who is a licensed psychologist at GLO. Meghan, DeeDee, and Marla, welcome. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. We are excited to talk with you guys all today about something that's important to all of us. So again, I'm Dr. Marla Martin, and I'm licensed psychologist here at GLO, and we're going to talk today about ADHD, specifically in girls. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to answer some questions kind of foundationally. So what is ADHD? What is it exactly? What are the symptoms that go along with that? How are diagnoses made? What should we look for? We're going to talk about what an evaluation looks like, what it should include. And then we'll go into treatment options, talk about what that means for school. How do we talk with school and work with school to develop accommodations? And give you guys information about what to do if you have concerns and where to go next. So that's kind of a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to actually start us out with just kind of the big question. What do we, let's all get on the same page with what we mean when we refer to ADHD. There's, in the mid 90s, we kind of dropped the term we're still all really familiar with, that ADD. And early on, we kind of had a distinction between ADD and ADHD. And the powers that be, whoever they are, dropped the ADD and just made one umbrella term, which is ADHD, which is Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And it really just encompasses difficulty with attention, hyperactivity, and then the combination of the two. So this first slide here, we're talking about the inattentive presentation of ADHD. So obviously there are individual differences in people, right? Some people can focus really well in general, and some people struggle. So there's always a variety. And so what we're talking about are symptoms that are often present. These aren't things that one would experience occasionally. Okay, so in inattentive presentation of ADHD, we're noticing often failing to give close attention to details, meaning like we might add instead of subtract, or we might miss little things here and there, trouble holding attention to tasks. Sometimes this doesn't happen if the task is really, really interesting. So sometimes people might say, well, it can't be ADHD because I can, my kiddo can play with Legos all day without breaking their focus. We're really talking about kind of like that super exciting, anything below that level of excitement, it's tough to hold attention. Sometimes people will say that it seems that even when you're talking to someone, they're just not really listening, or they're daydreaming and they're off somewhere else. Inattentive ADHD will have a difficulty following through. So wrapping up final details to projects. Sometimes they might be able to get going, but then we might find it hard to kind of take all of the pieces and put them together. Trouble organizing, might avoid or dislike things that are mentally taxing. So sometimes it's a little like procrastination. We might have gung-ho and get started, and then it's like, this is getting tough. And so we might find ourselves avoiding that. Often losing things. So this is kind of the, shoot, where are my keys? Where my wallet? Where's my backpack? Where's my shoes? That kind of thing. And then just easily distracted. So we might be doing something, and any sound, we might hear other sounds in the other room, people talking. It's just really hard to stay focused. And then the last one is just often forgetful. So people might say like, oh, I thought I knew what I was coming in here to do, or I know what my teacher asked me to do, but I forgot, or I meant to turn that in, but I forgot. So that's that inattentive presentation.
Can I just add on really quick, Marla? You mentioned that sometimes these students can focus for long periods of time, but it's on something they're super motivated by. That can also be a sign of ADHD. The hyperfocus. The hyperfocus is something that people don't always think of, but can be a sign of ADHD, is hyperfocusing to the point where you don't realize how much time has gone by and things like that. It goes with that time blindness piece.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. So going on to the hyperactivity impulsivity symptoms, and for both of these types, in order for a diagnosis to be made, we're looking for 6 or more of these 9 symptoms in individuals up to age 16, and age 17 and over, we're looking for 5 out of 9 symptoms to be present. So again, there are individual differences. Some of us may have 1 or 2 of these things that are just part of us, but that doesn't necessarily mean it reaches the clinical criteria. So again, 6 out of 9 for kiddos, and 5 out of 9 for 17 and up. So hyperactive presentation will look like fidgeting, having a tough time sitting down. This would include like places where we're expected to sit. So the dinner table, circle time in class, or sitting in your chair. This doesn't necessarily mean that the individual will refuse to sit or will fail to sit. Sometimes it may be, I do terrible on airplanes and I just cannot sit still. I do because I have to, but it just really, really takes a lot of effort, more effort than you would expect it maybe for your peers or counterparts. So sometimes that's what that looks like. Hyperactivity impulsivity can also look like running around all the time, feeling restless, being able to play or engage in things quietly. Sometimes this will look like difficulty kind of gauging the sound that is necessary for a room that you're in. So you may come in and, hey, I'm here. And maybe you haven't noticed that either a conversation was happening or it's more of a quiet vibe in the room at the time. So sometimes that can be tough. Hyperactive symptom is just being on the go, or your motor just runs higher than other people or your peers. Sometimes that can appear through talking excessively. I have parents will say, oh gosh, they're just a motor mouth and they're pleasant and wonderful, but they just talk all the time. And this will include maybe blurting or interrupting, just not being able to hold on to your part of the story because you're just kind of itching to get it out. And then just a hard time waiting your turn. Again, this doesn't necessarily mean that people with ADHD symptoms like this won't wait their turn or they want to intrude over others, but it's a sign of something that they just have a hard time controlling. So when we have a diagnosis, there's three types of diagnoses that can be made. One is ADHD inattentive type. Another, and that's the most common form of diagnosis we have. The second type is ADHD combined type. That's the second most common presentation. That's where someone will present the 5 or 6 out of 9 inattentive symptoms, and also the 5 or 6 out of 9 of the hyperactive symptoms. So then they would get a combined type diagnosis. And then the last type of diagnosis is ADHD hyperactive type. That's where they meet criteria for these hyperactivity symptoms, but not the inattentive. And that's the least common presentation of ADHD overall. So why is it important to
Marla, you are muted. We can't hear you anymore. Maybe
Uh-oh, yep, I think my paper touched it.
Start over slide again.
No, thank you. Prevalence, ADHD is the most common neurodevelopmental disorder that's diagnosed in kiddos. About 8% studies tell us present in kids and adolescents. We do notice some research shows 2-to-1 diagnoses, boys over girls. Some research even shows 3-to-1, more boys being diagnosed than girls. And again, we'll get into this. A lot of that is because of what we've come to expect or look for when we're looking at symptoms of ADHD. And again, like I said previously, the most common is the inattentive type, followed by combined type, followed by hyperactivity. So all of these symptoms, in order to have a diagnosis, we need to have presence of these symptoms prior to age 12, and then we need to have them present in 2 or more settings. So if someone comes in and they notice some of these symptoms, but it's only at home, but at school and with social domains or at work, at everything, these symptoms are not present, we're not going to be able to make a diagnosis. So these symptoms are going to be present and show up maybe in different forms, but they're going to be present in more than one setting in your life. And then symptoms need to be causing some sort of difficulty in functioning in those areas, so in home life or in school or in your relationships. So again, there's individual differences. We all have different levels of attention and ability to sit still and things like that. That doesn't mean it's ADHD. We need 6 of 9 symptoms, and we need, prior to age 12, multiple settings, and then it needs to cause some sort of functional difficulty. And the last thing we need is we need it to not be better explained by another disorder. So I'll talk about this in a little bit, but anxiety, PTSD, there's the other diagnoses that can really kind of dress up like ADHD and have symptoms of inattention or distractibility. And so when we're looking at symptoms, it's important that we unbraid them in a way that helps us make sure we know what the root causes are. So when we look at, one more thing about that slide. Sorry, DeeDee, the last one. What we notice is in this inattentive type, and this is kind of where we slide over to what do we typically see in girls. Girls tend to, the research we have on how presentations differ between boys and girls tells us that girls tend to show more internalized symptoms of ADHD in general than boys do. And so what that might look like is distractibility, difficulty concentrating. It might look like anxiety. Sometimes we'll see that the anxiety, though, isn't rooted in something specific. It's not a generalized anxiety, but it's anxiety about being distracted, or anxiety about not being able to concentrate, or anxiety about daydreaming in class when you know you should be listening and getting the material. And you can imagine if you know that you're in there to learn and you can't focus and can't pay attention, how stressful that would become. Internalized symptoms also can look like becoming bored easily, maybe hopping between hobbies. It can show up in friendships, having a hard time reading social cues, maybe a hard time listening and kind of hearing nuances in conversation. It can also look like perfectionism. And sometimes this is a tough one in girls as well, because parents might say, well, she's kind of a perfectionist. She will not turn in an assignment unless it's done just so. But again, that kind of leans toward what Meghan and I were talking about as far as being really fixated or hyper focused on something versus being able to zoom out and see the whole picture. Fidgeting also can look like picking. It doesn't have to be moving around, running around. It can be fidgeting, twirling your hair all the time, picking your nails, picking at your skin, maybe to a point to where you're not either noticing or you can't stop doing that even though you kind of want to. So those are some examples of internalized symptoms that don't really kind of look like that typical ADHD diagnosis that we might think of, kind of the kiddo running around crazy in Target, right? These are some symptoms that we want to be having conversations with our girls, saying, hey, are you able to focus in class? You get distracted easily. You may not be able to see it on the outside. The reason it's important to have a diagnosis is because undertreated or untreated ADHD is linked to other diagnoses like depression, anxiety, conduct disorders, substance abuse. There's lots of things that we want to avoid for our children that treating ADHD appropriately can help us do. So it's really important that we see these symptoms, notice them early, because it opens the door for treatment and accommodations. Okay, so I gave you a long list of symptoms to look for, and all of that sounds kind of official, but like, what does it look like at home? What should I be noticing when we're doing homework, or what should I be noticing or listening for when I'm at parent-teacher conferences? Sometimes if kiddo seems like they're not listening, or they're just like, you have to repeat yourself and you have to kind of say, hey, pay attention. And again, this often happens even when a kiddo isn't contrary to what you're saying. It's not that they're trying to be difficult, they're just not able to focus on what you're saying. So pay attention for that. It may not be as much of their choice to not listen as it might be that they have a difficulty with that. It can look like daydreaming, always being off in their own world, procrastinating tasks until the last minute. And a lot of times what that means is, we're waiting until we have a deadline, and the deadline becomes the fuel to push us through getting that thing done, right? Moderating ourselves getting started on something is an executive function. And when we have ADHD, we're often lacking in that. So procrastination is important to look for. It's not, again, it may not be volitional. It may not be like, oh, I just don't feel like doing it. If a kiddo needs frequent reminders, or reminders if you give them more than one task. So if it's go feed the dog, then take out the trash, then get your backpack ready. If we're always missing request 2 and 3, that's important to notice. Taking longer to finish tasks or homework. Again, that fidgeting, excessive talking, or trouble managing emotions can all be things that we can look for, and we want to have a conversation with kiddo or with our teen about these things and how it's affecting them. I want to give you a couple of examples of what this might look like also from school, and kind of how we approach homework, grades, and relationships. So a good example is, someone with maybe more a stereotypical presentation of ADHD might have a multi-step assignment. Maybe they've got a presentation or research paper that they've got to put together. It is not entertaining or interesting, and so we're going to procrastinate because it's like, oh, I can't get myself up to do that. And if we kind of take that typical presentation, or kind of what we view as maybe the boy presentation, he might just avoid it or just forget about it. I'm going to play video games instead. I'll do anything but that. On the other hand, the presentation we often see in girls is that they procrastinate the assignment, even though the whole time they know it's sitting there waiting for them. So we see anxiety, we don't see them working on the assignment. So we think, oh, they just don't want to do it, or they're just avoiding it. But then we wait for that fuel to come of the deadline. And then like the last minute, everybody has to be a fuss. Mom's helping cut things out or type things out. And, everybody kind of has to go to go mode to get this done, because it is important to her to get it done. So you can see in these two scenarios, boy may just not do the assignment, so he gets a 0. And girl turns in the assignment. It may not be the highest quality work, but it gets done, so she gets a B-. Teacher's going to notice the 0 and say, hey, what's going on? You didn't turn anything in. But they're not going to really raise a flag about this B-, even though it required a lot of work and kind of had the same set of symptoms. It just was a different outcome. And so sometimes I'll have parents say, well, it can't be ADHD. She's got A's and B's, or she does actually do her homework. It just takes 3 days instead of a half an hour, things like that. So make sure we're looking out for the different ways things can sometimes look on the outside. And then lastly, social maturity, in general, not all the time, but in general, boys and girls can have a different arc of maturity when it comes to social interactions. And so for girls with ADHD, sometimes it's really hard to keep up with that social maturity. And so we might notice that they, again, like they're still telling jokes like that you would tell in 3rd grade, but girls are in 5th grade. And so those jokes don't land the same, or people might get hurt differently. And so it can be really frustrating because they're like, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I'm just kind of not keeping up socially. So that can be something to look for as well. And then lastly, hormone changes. Research tells us that hormone changes are linked to more intensive experiences of your ADHD symptoms. And so, there might be symptoms that you noticed in 3rd and 4th grade that now in middle school are just heightened. And that's valid, that is a real thing. So if it's something that maybe once was not to a level that it was disruptive and it is now, that's not uncommon. Okay, so you guys can read through these, but I just wanted to put some quotes in of things that I often hear and that our team often hears when people and families come in for testing. They might say she's got trouble with relationships and she's not maybe able to think before saying, or she gets hyper-focused on small things and then gets really upset if we're encouraging her to move on from those things. Losing things, break things, just kind of a bull in a china shop. So those are common things. The next slide has just a few more quotes that we often hear. A big one that I'll touch on this list is we hear all the time COVID. COVID really put a light on learning for a lot of families because, kiddos who were staying up all night doing homework assignments, now parents are seeing it. They really now I saw how my child was learning and how difficult it was for them to pay attention during class. And I'm watching their peers do it, but they're struggling to do so. Distance learning required a huge amount of self-starting and initiation. You had to be able to keep yourself on task a lot more than we did when we were in the classroom. And so it's not uncommon at all for families to say before distance learning, everything was kind of fine. And then things just really got off track. So if that's your experience, that's very valid as well. Okay, so my last slide, I talk about, okay, what do you do, right? We've got all these things to look for. We know the symptoms that we're looking for. So the types of evaluations that we're gonna, that people will have when we're looking to get a diagnosis of ADHD, we've got diagnostic evaluation here, neuropsych evaluation. Basically, those are evaluations that will look at multiple domains. So we're going to look at mood, we're going to look at cognitive functioning, we're going to look at personality, we're going to look in different buckets, so to speak. And that's what a neuropsych or a diagnostic evaluation is going to do. And so we're going to say, how is memory functioning? How is language? How is their mood? And we're going to look in all those areas and make sure we know where these symptoms coming from. The difference with a psychoeducational evaluation, which is in that larger bubble, is that's going to include academic performance or that academic piece. Most neuropsych evals won't include the academic piece. Some do, but most of them do not. And so a psychoeducational evaluation is going to be all of that together. We're going to look at, again, social emotional functioning, academic performance, cognitive functioning, symptoms, and we're going to be able to give you a full view of what's going on with kiddo. And that's the type of evaluation we offer at Groves. And then also you'll see on there a special education evaluation. DeeDee is going to talk about this more in a little bit, but that's the evaluation that school will give, and that's going to determine if and what type of accommodations are needed at school. So they're going to look at academic functioning. They'll observe kiddo in classroom and do surveys and questionnaires with parents and teachers to get an overall view of what the educational needs of kiddo is. So that's not a diagnostic evaluation that would result in a diagnosis of ADHD. The others are, but that one is not. But that's part of the process as well. And DeeDee will talk a little bit more about that briefly.
Okay, I'm here to talk to you about the different treatment options for people with ADHD, especially girls. This will include some treatments that you can do and also some accommodations to look for when it comes to working with your school. So the first thing to think about when you are exploring treatment for ADHD is making sure that you're working with a professional who is considering all of the different presenting concerns and possible comorbidities, because we really can't find the right treatment option without really determining the root cause of the issue. So, for example, if medication is going to be one of the things you explore as a treatment option, and your student also has dysregulated eating, you would want your provider to know that, because there are some medications that affect students' appetites. And that's something that maybe you wouldn't want if you already know that your student has some dysregulated eating challenges as well. So it's important to be really open and honest with the providers that you're exploring treatment with about everything that's going on, so that they can consider all factors when making a plan for working with your student. So some of the treatment options are therapy, medication, lifestyle changes, environmental changes. So those are things that the student wouldn't necessarily change themselves, but they are things that either at home or in school, we can set up their environment in such a way that makes them more successful. And then coaching and support groups. One thing you will hear me say probably multiple times today is that the research shows us that the most effective treatment plans are typically a combination of these things. Starting a medication without doing any lifestyle changes or environmental accommodations will help a little bit, but it's not going to be the magic bullet. So it's important to consider multiple of these options at once in order to have the most effective plan. And it's also, I put this visual on this slide specifically because it's also important to note that progress is not going to be linear. There are going to be ups and downs. And like Marla said, there may be changes in hormone levels, which might make us want to revisit medications that we're on, or dietary changes, or things like that. So progress is going to be over a long period of time, and there are going to be some peaks and valleys there. So the first treatment option I'm going to talk a little bit about is therapy. So some things you'll want to consider when you're thinking about therapy is working with a therapist who has experience specifically with ADHD in girls, as well as whatever other comorbidities might be happening with the student, so that they can take all of those factors into consideration in their work with the student. The other thing that's going to be super important for therapy and for ADHD coaching, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is including family education and supporting carryover so that it also can change in the home environment, not just the therapy environment. So one example of that is often when we are a parent of a student and we get this new diagnosis of ADHD, we need to reframe our mindset and our expectations about the behaviors that we're seeing from our student. We now know with this ADHD diagnosis that some of the things that we maybe thought were more intentional aren't as intentional. Another thing to keep in mind that I think is new to parents often when you get an ADHD diagnosis is that people with ADHD have executive functioning skills that are 2 to 3 years behind their peers. And 2 to 3 years when you're a kid going through development is a long time. It's a big gap. So executive functioning skills are skills like planning, impulse control, organizing my stuff, being able to manage my time, things like that. So if you have a 10-year-old who's been diagnosed with ADHD, you as a parent would be participating in this therapy or this ADHD coaching, and you may learn that the expectations you're placing on your student for things that they can do independently are not things that you should expect them to be able to do independently, and you may have to offer more support there. It's going to be really important when you're starting therapy to keep that mindset in mind. It's not just therapy for the student. it's going to be therapy for the family as well. There's a couple examples here of treatments that are specific to impulse control, just to give a couple examples. So cognitive behavioral therapy might be something you might consider if you are experiencing a lot of difficulty with really impulsive behavior. And then behavior therapy and parent training is another one. Typically that's going to be, sometimes it's called parent-child interaction therapy. I'll talk about some more options for that as well going forward. Okay, medication management is another one that is important to think about. One thing that I've learned in my journey through learning more and really diving deep into ADHD is really how long these medications have been around and how much research we have done on them. So medication options for ADHD are some of the most studied and have been around the longest. And we have not only short-term data, but also long-term data about how these medications affect people. And they really are really well regulated. And there's a lot of misconceptions out there about them not being safe. And they can be, as long as you're working with a medical provider. There's also a ton of different options for medications. People typically only think of a stimulant. There are stimulant medications, there are non-stimulant medications. There are also short-term release and long-term release medications. Sometimes it's a pill. There are also patches. So it's important to meet with someone who can talk through all your different options. And again, a recurring theme is make sure that person knows all the things that are going on with that student so that they're exploring medications that are taking into consideration anxiety, if that's a factor, or depression, if that's a factor. It's also going to be important to work with a doctor who understands hormones playing a role. And that might be for students who start a medication when they're 8, and then when they go through puberty and start menstruating, maybe their hormones change and that medication needs to change as well. And again, a reminder that medication on its own is typically not going to be a magic bullet. It also needs to come with understanding of how the disorder is affecting the student from parents, from teachers, accommodations in school, environmental changes, maybe some lifestyle changes. It's not just ever going to be the medication that is doing it all. Another thing that's really important and can be really effective is lifestyle changes. Students with ADHD really benefit from being on a consistent routine, especially a sleep schedule, making sure we're getting adequate sleep. Sometimes that means we are turning screens off an hour before bed so that the blue light isn't affecting our sleep. There's more and more research coming out about the brain-gut connection and how a diet can affect your mental health. So that's going to be something that's important to pay attention to. Exercise, especially for those kids that have the hyperactive impulsive type of ADHD, but also the inattentive type, because if they're internalizing a lot of symptoms like anxiety, getting some exercise in can sometimes help get those endorphins going and clear some of that to be able to think more clearly. Getting outside, getting sunlight, vitamin D, maybe you build in some meditation or mindfulness practice, and that's something you can build up over time. It definitely takes practice. So sometimes your first meditation or mindfulness session might be 30 seconds or 1 minute, and then you build up to longer and longer. But these lifestyle changes can make a really huge difference along with medication and therapy. Environmental accommodations, again, are going to be things that are not something the student does themselves or something that a doctor necessarily regulates, but are going to be more things that we as the adults in their life can help set them up for success. So it might be helping them set up a different structure or routine. It might be helping set up their space. So for instance, maybe you as the adult in the home help set up a homework space where it's not in their bedroom, they're not doing their homework in bed, they're not doing their homework on the couch in front of TV. They have a place that's a clean surface, Maybe that place does not have their electronics in it. And then allow for breaks, of course, but having a structured, safe, distraction-free zone to be doing homework is going to be important as well. Classroom teachers can also help with environmental accommodations. It could be where they sit in the classroom. It could be having check-ins with their planner or check-ins with parents to make sure that they're on track with bringing their materials home. Maybe teachers are helping set up shorter due dates for different parts of assignments rather than just one due date for the whole entire thing. So environmental accommodations can go a long way. After DeeDee talks a little bit more about 504 plans and IEPs, there are some slides coming that have examples of accommodations that can be helpful for students. And we won't read through every single one of them, but those will be helpful for you to refer back to as examples of things you could talk to the school about, including in a 504 plan. So we'll give you some more specifics on that. And then coaching and support groups. An ADHD coach is going to be someone who's outside of the family that the student meets with and that person helps them identify what are your areas of strength, what are your areas of growth, and how can I help you create a system that's going to work for you for organizing your things, staying on track with due dates, managing your time, building up those study skills, building up those self-advocacy skills. ADHD coaches are also available for adults, so it's not just for students. And then as students are moving on to college, thinking about if they have an ADHD diagnosis and they've been on an IEP or 504, it's possible that the college will offer some accommodations too. But there's also accommodations that students can use on their own that maybe aren't even part of an official plan, like visiting the writing center to have someone help edit a paper, or forming a study group with kids that are in their same class, or seeing a tutor, meeting with a coach on a regular basis. And then as for support groups, I just wanted to mention, oftentimes support groups are for parents of students who have ADHD. Sometimes they are for the students themselves. If you go on CHADD's website, CHADD, they're one of the national organizations that's really well known for support for ADHD. They have great webinars, great resources. I encourage you to check it out. One of the things they offer on their website is they have these different parent-to-parent groups, and they put parents in groups based on their region of where they live. So there's a chance that you'll be put in a group with people that you could meet with in person too, or that maybe have similar experiences that are specific to your community. I know there are also local organizations that have these support groups, especially for parents of students with ADHD. I know psychology consultation specialists used to have groups. I don't know if they still do. I believe LifeFX does as well. So there are these groups available for parents to be able to bounce ideas off of one another and just talk about things that are happening at home. There's a book recommendation on here as well, Understanding Girls with ADHD, How They Feel, Why They Do What They Do. It's a great book, excellent resource. That's another thing that you could check out.
Okay, thank you. I am here to talk to you about how to approach teachers, and there will be additional information, as Meghan said, following my slides about specific accommodations. So as Marla talked about early on in the beginning of this presentation, girls with ADHD can often mask their symptoms, especially the inattentive type. Like the example of like the student whose work was taking so much effort and time and then eventually was turned in and she gets a B- versus a student who may just not do the work and they're getting a 0, and the teacher may not notice that the B- versus the 0. And so there's a great cost to the student's well-being, to her health. And so it's important when approaching teachers to affirm the diagnosis, to emphasize the reality of the symptoms that your child is experiencing, and then to also use that to kind of build relationship and collaboration with teachers so that you can work together as a team to develop a plan that's going to be effective and appropriate for your child. There's a resource here that's available that gives a really helpful visual that can be a tool to reference when you're building that relationship and conversation with teachers, to show kind of the real, like the iceberg visual, and that showing like how so many of the symptoms that your student might be experiencing are beneath the surface. And so this visual kind of gives that as a tool to use in when you're having those conversations with school and needing to really outline kind of what the concerns are and how these difficulties show up and what the day-to-day is like for your child. It's really important to then kind of use that collaboration to get the teacher and the school on board so that you can find and identify those interventions that are going to be based in research, and really foster clear and explicit communication and coordination between school and home.
DeeDee, is it possible for you to click on that link and show that resource?
I will try. Let's see. All right, is that showing? I think it is. So this is the visual, and it's called Explaining ADHD to Teachers. It's available on the Attitude website, which is additudemag.com, which again, this resource will be available to participants after we are done with this presentation. We'll be able to share the resource so you have a reference of all these types of materials to click onto. So again, this is kind of showing how at the tip of the iceberg, there may be some of these symptoms and evidence of the difficulty the student is experiencing, but only an eighth of that iceberg is showing. And beneath the surface could be a host of difficulties, including other comorbidities such as anxiety or dysregulated eating and so forth. So I like how this visual provides a way to have that conversation with teachers and really be clear in affirming how the difficulties are showing up. Okay. Now,
You can just go back to the tab right next to it where it says Girls and ADHD.
and I can't see that on my screen because of like.
Oh, here.
All right.
Just stop sharing for a minute and then you can pull it back up. Sorry, I didn't mean to throw you off.
It won't. All right. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is how, when advocating for your student, you're probably thinking, well, what can the school do specifically? And so, as Marla was talking about earlier, there can be a special education evaluation done at a school. However, schools do not diagnose ADHD. So in order to have any sort of plan in place, like an IEP or a 504 plan, there needs to be a diagnosis, and that has to be completed by a licensed psychologist or a physician and so forth. So again, having that diagnosis is a part of the process that then can allow for possibility of either an IEP or a 504. And so the 504 is where you will have a student's diagnosis of ADHD may lead to specific accommodations that the school will provide related to that diagnosis. To qualify for an IEP, the student has to meet one of the 13 disabilities that are listed in the IDEA, and that can include ADHD. The diagnosis of ADHD is considered an other health disability category in Minnesota. And again, if the student has the ADHD diagnosis and it's written and it's an assigned like medical diagnosis by a licensed psychologist, for example, that documentation can be provided to the school to then have the conversation about whether they qualify for the IEP or the 504 plan. There are resources on the GLO website about an IEP versus a 504 that provide further explanation about the difference. There's also this resource by the Duke Center for Girls and Women with ADHD that also provides a nice summary of the differences between getting an IEP versus a 504 plan. And we'll be talking a little bit more about accommodations. This Duke resource gives examples of what accommodations might look like. And again, kind of outlines how the IEP is different from a 504 and what goes into the different plans. And they also have additional links to very helpful resources on sites like CHAD and Attitude that give parents that information and resource for teasing apart questions related to these types of plans with schools. And the last thing I'm going to be talking a little bit about is when collaborating with schools and teachers, again, the team coordination is essential, and that coordination between school and home is shown through research to be a crucial part of providing support to students with ADHD. And so when you're collaborating, an example of a research-based strategy that can be provided either through an IEP or a 504 would be something like a daily report card. And this has been shown to be effective with students with ADHD because it provides an explicit identification of goals for that student and emphasizes positive reinforcement and positive feedback, as well as positive communication with that student, with school, as well as with parents. And that will help the student to develop the skills to work through their different needs that they may have related to their ADHD. So there are examples of the daily report card from Attitude about why it is helpful as an accommodation because of how it explicitly outlines expectations for that student. And it's also plays the role of building that cooperation between school and home, parents and teachers, and how the effect of that helps the student develop their skills and build more confidence and shift the difficulties that they're having toward more success and help setting them up for that success. This is an example of an application that was developed by the Florida International University that again is just a form of the daily report card through an app with your phone that again could be helpful for your school with your family with that collaboration if that is something identified. They have really a nice video that explains sort of this positive behavior reinforcement strategy and why it is effective and the research behind it. It's also will be important to involve the school psychologist or counselor, and again, identifying those strategies that are proactive so that you're assisting your child to develop their skills in executive functioning and managing their ADHD and helping set the stage for them so they can make steps toward feeling that success.
Great. One other thing I wanted to mention before getting into some examples of specific accommodations that you might see on a 504 plan for a student is one piece of the puzzle that's going to be really important for communication between school and home is medication trials. Letting the school know that your student is starting a medication. That's going to be important for a couple different reasons. Number one, we want to know if there's any side effects happening at school that that parents need to be aware of at home. And we also want teacher observations of how that medication might be working for that student, which can help with any adjustments that need to be made to the dosage or the type of medication that the student is on. Sometimes parents feel that they don't want to inform the school that a student is starting a medication because they're seeing it more as like a blind study, and they really want to determine, is the medication doing anything? They don't want the teacher to be skewed by the fact that they know the student is starting the medication, but we really need to team with those teachers so that they can help us with what are they seeing in school when we're not there? What's happening during the day that might be different than what's happening at home as the medication wears off? And how do those observations drive adjustments in medication? So that's a really important open line of communication that needs to be there. Getting into some of the accommodations. So you can accommodate the classroom environment by having an accommodation in a 504 plan that says they need preferential seating. Oftentimes we think preferential seating is always the front of the room right by the teacher, but that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes preferential seating is away from the window, so we're not distracted by the window. Sometimes preferential seating is in the back of the classroom. So it doesn't always have to be the very front seat, but it does need to be wherever the student experiences the fewest distractions. It could also mean using timers or alarms in the classroom to help with time management. It could mean that this student is allowed to take more breaks than maybe peers who don't have these accommodations available to them. It could be making sure that they have opportunity for physical activity. One important thing that you as parents can advocate for your student is that recess or physical activity time should never be taken away as a punishment for not completing work or speaking out of turn or things like that in class. That is something that you can have as an accommodation, that they need to have that time every day, especially if they're a hyperactive, impulsive kiddo, to get that energy out. That's only going to help. So that should be never be something that's held against the student, that they have to miss that activity time to get that energy out. Another category of accommodations that you might see is help with organization. So maybe like the student is provided with an assignment notebook or an electronic calendar. Maybe a set of textbooks is provided, an extra set to keep at home. So that the reason students aren't turning in homework isn't because they forgot their book at school. That's an easy way to make sure they always have what they need. Maybe it's providing typed notes or an outline of the lesson to help the student organize their ideas and take their own notes. One thing we know about students with ADHD is they often, not always, but often have difficulty with processing speed and or working memory, which makes note-taking really difficult because it's either hard for them to remember everything they need to write down before they write it, or they're processing really slowly. So by the time they've processed it and written it down, the teacher is now 4 thoughts beyond what we're writing. So providing the notes helps the student to follow along with the lesson and really be able to focus on listening to the teacher rather than trying to just quickly write everything down. Or providing an outline of the lesson and having the student take their own notes. Also teaching note-taking strategies so that students aren't using so much time to try to write every little thing down, but teaching them how they can use abbreviations. What are things that are important to write down versus not important to write down? Another thing to keep in mind about students with ADHD is they often are taking in all of their environment, and that makes it hard for them to sift out what's important for me to focus on and what's not. And they often end up focusing on everything. So sometimes with note taking, it's really hard for students with ADHD to delineate what's important for me to write in my notes versus what can I just leave behind and it's not as important. And so they are tempted to write everything down. So teaching those strategies can be really helpful. Or have a buddy take notes for the student. This is especially something that I've seen with college accommodations for students, is another student in the class is taking notes anyway for themselves. The student with ADHD gets a copy of those notes. There are also accommodations for completing assignments and tests. So checking in with a student before they've completed an assignment to see, did you hear the instructions? Do you understand the instructions? Do you need me to repeat anything? Or give the instructions in writing along with giving them aloud. Give an example so the student has a visual in their mind of really what you're looking for the end product. It could be taking a test in a different room that's quieter, has fewer distractions. And an accommodation that we see often is extended time to complete projects, assignments, or tests. Another one that can kind of go along with this, and depending on the school, I've seen people be successful with this and other schools are really rigid on this, but shortening the length of the assignment too. So if the assignment is meant to be 15 math problems to practice a math concept, maybe your student is doing 10 of those problems or 8 of those problems, taking into consideration how much longer it takes your student to complete one problem compared to their peers. So that's another possibility there. Giving directions. This is something the teacher needs to pay attention to if it's in the 504 plan. Again, providing a lesson outline, giving instructions in one step at a time, or using visuals to help remember the instructions, giving the instructions written down. All of those can be super helpful for our students. Also, providing that rubric that describes exactly what the teacher is looking for can be really helpful as well. It kind of gives the student a checklist of what they can go back and make sure that their assignment includes. So we're on our last slide, what to do if you're concerned, and then we will open it up to questions. I've already been seeing a bunch of questions coming in. Looks like we're going to have about a half hour, so we'll have time to get to most of them, I think. The first thing to do if you're concerned is talk to a professional. So you could start with your student's pediatrician or general practitioner and ask if that person is not experienced or not an expert in ADHD, ask for a referral to mental health or a psychiatrist to support that. You can seek an assessment. So you can either start that assessment through your pediatrician or doctor's office and they can refer you somewhere. Some pediatricians will do that testing on their own. Or you can go to a place like Groves that does full psychoeducational evaluations where you'll get cognitive information, academic achievement information, social, emotional, executive functioning, attention, all of that in one report. I would recommend that route because especially with these girls, that's what's going to give you the best picture of all the different possible comorbidities that could be going on and really help make that differential diagnosis as accurate as possible. Sometimes a general practitioner, when they do an ADHD evaluation, will do a survey of parents and a survey of teachers, but they maybe don't have the student sit down and do actual tasks in front of them and have that data with it as well. So I've seen that typically if you go through a psychiatrist, a psychologist, the evaluation provides more information about what could be going on. Again, keeping the lines of communication open with your school, even if it's just starting with, hey, this is something we're thinking about for our student. We're exploring it. We have an appointment with our doctor, just so it's on the school's radar, the teacher's radar, that it's something you're considering, it's something you're concerned about, and you're going to be working through the process. And then if you want more information about how Groves can support students with ADHD, either through an assessment or through tutoring or through speech language therapy, summer programs, anything like that. If you go to the Contact Us part of our website, you can fill out a little form with your name, and then it takes you to a calendar page where you can schedule a call with someone that can talk you through all your different options. They'll start that call with, just tell us about your student, and then guide you in the direction that will be most helpful for you, your student, and your family.
Thank you to our wonderful panel and that really informative presentation. So I'm going to do my best to moderate the questions here and get to all of them. I see people are putting questions into the chat and to the Q&A. That is just fine. Go ahead, if you're going to put new questions in, put them into the chat so they're all in one space. But for those of you who've put questions into the Q&A, I see them and we're going to try to get to all of them. So I'd like to start with a question for Marla that a family has. Can you talk a little bit about, if a family is seeing some of these behaviors, how can we tell if they're age appropriate or not? Like, what's that line on age appropriate, and how do we differentiate that? And then can you also remind us on that list of behaviors, how many of them again do we need to have in order to say, okay, red flag, I'm concerned now?
Good question. So I'll answer the second part first because it's a concrete answer. So out of 9 potential symptoms for a diagnosis to be given in kids under 17, you need 6 to be present as rated as often or more. And then for individuals over 17, you need 5. So there's the answer to that. As far as age appropriate, sometimes the easiest place to go, the resources that were given in here, so the website like CHAD, Attitude Mag, those are really good places to go to just look at, to look for answers to your questions. They have parent tabs that have a lot of information about a lot of different topics. Your pediatrician is also a good place to go. They are used to tracking kids, every year. And so they tend to have really good information about generally what is to be expected in this given age, and also like the ranges, because sometimes as parents, our only view is what we see. And so if our child tends to maybe hang with peers who are ahead in certain areas or not, it can be hard for us to know if that's an actual gauge or if that's just reflective of our surroundings. So I would start with the resources in this webinar are good resources to start with. It keeps you from just delving into Google, which can get dicey fast. And then I would say going to primary care is a good place to go. And then also talking to the child's teacher, like they have a consistent sample size of people the same age as you're human. And so I think they're also a good place to start.
Great, thank you. And there's a follow-up question about some of those behaviors. If a parent is seeing a lot of repetitive behaviors or even tics, is that something that should be flagging in their mind for ADHD? Can that be an indicator?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I think that's this, but the response is the same, right? That's a question for your pediatrician. Bring it up at your well-child visit or schedule a visit to talk about that. Tics can definitely sometimes be present in ADHD, but also can be a sign of an individual tic disorder, or it can be a sign of anxiety or a whole host of other things. So yeah, so maybe yes, maybe no.
Thanks. There's some questions around 504 plans. So DeeDee, I'm going to throw these questions to you, and Marla, you may have some insight as well. So the question is can a school deny a family of a 504 plan if their grades are good, right? Like we're talking about that girl who is able to finish the homework, is able to get the B. Can the school say, you know what, no, we're not going to give you a 504 plan? Kind of what do you do if they do that?
Sure. Yeah. So the eligibility for a 504 is not necessarily hinging on those grades, because they will have evidence of the amount of effort that student is putting into it, or if there's a significant amount of time, or there have been redos of assignments, or they've had extensions and so forth. So the school will be documenting like what did it take for that student to achieve their work. And they are going through carefully kind of those specific details on the student's performance. So if they're impaired substantially, if it's limiting their capacity to function, and complete that work, and the ADHD is showing to impact those areas, that can be documented and included in the process of the getting a 504. Is there anything else Marla or Megan would add to that?
I would just say this is where parent advocacy is going to be so huge, because the school, like we've mentioned before, sees the B minus. They don't see the staying up till 3 in.the morning, the last minute trip to the store to buy the poster board, the parent doing some of the work for the student because they just are so desperate to get it done. So if a school is questioning the need for a 504 because it's not affecting the student's grades, this is where you as a parent need to say, yes, the student is achieving those grades, but these are all things that are happening behind the scenes in order to get those grades. And I would say the school, once you have reached out about wanting a 504, the school might include tracking some of those things as part of that process, but the school isn't going to be tracking those things in general all the time. So it's really going to be on you as the parent to keep track of those things and advocate for your student in those meetings.
Here's a follow-up question to that. As for a family who is, working on, okay, should we proceed with advocating to get a 504? Our child we're looking ahead to potentially post high school and going into college. And we're managing the ADHD symptoms at home pretty well, either with medication or with therapy. Should we push to get that 504 plan? Could it harm the college admissions process? Like, if we're at that crossroads as a family, what are some of the recommendations? Maybe DeeDee, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I don't know I don't think it would harm the college application process per se, because in order to get support in college, you're the one providing that information. It's up to the student and the family to reach out to the Office of Disability at that university or college and find out what their process is for requesting those accommodations. So they're not going to necessarily know about that unless you're asking for that, and that's separate from the application and the entrance into the college or university. And we work with students here, advocate to help support them in advocating for looking at what universities do provide for accommodations. What are the supports that are available for students through tutoring, through coaching, whether it is for ADHD or other supports that students need. And colleges and universities have a variety of different ways that they provide those supports. And so it could be helpful to really take a deeper look at what those are being offered and compare them. The CHAD and Attitude magazine also provide really helpful resources related to this question and this topic about accommodations and that transition from high school to college. So there are really good resources related to that topic as well through their sites.
I have a couple thoughts on this one too. I would say lean toward having the 504 in place. And if the student doesn't need the accommodations all the time, they don't have to take them. If the student feels they can take the test in the regular classroom, they don't have to go to another classroom. It's an option that's available to them. And one of the things that I think is important to remember is when your student is at home with you, you have control over the environment and the structure, and you're helping them with a lot of that routine. There's a lot of other elements that are new to the student going to college, like they're living in a new home for the first time by themselves, potentially. They are meeting new friends, potentially. Their class sizes are much larger, potentially. Maybe they're sitting in an hour-and-a-half long lecture instead of a 45-minute one. And my understanding of these services in college is that they are hard to get if you don't have a history of having them in high school or middle school or at some point in your educational career. So having that 504 in place in high school will help to get those supports if you need them when your student goes to college. Having that history of that support will be helpful.
We also have upcoming this school year, we will have a webinar just like this that is specifically focused on, we have a guest speaker who does college counseling and career exploration, and I believe there will even be a potential panel of students as well specifically talking about that, so that could be a good resource as well for families that have a child or a student at that age. There's quite a few questions about evaluation. So Marla, I'm going to take up a little bit of your time, and of course, Meghan and DeeDee, let us know what you have to add. There are a lot of providers across the state that do diagnostic evaluation, and Marla, you showed a little bit of like, okay, here are the different types of evaluations you can find. One of the questions in here is, how far out do people schedule to get evaluations done? Like, how quickly can you get them done? And I'll just make a note of that. And then there's some meatier questions for you, Marla. What we'll find kind of across providers is that waiting lists or scheduling times for comprehensive diagnostic evaluation can range anywhere from 2 months to over a year. So it really does vary. At Grove specifically, we say families are going to probably wait somewhere between 6 to 9 months. Sometimes depending on how that list moves and how phone calls go, it is a little bit shorter. One of the things that we do at Groves though is if you get in touch with us, we'll listen to understand where are you at in your journey and what is the need that you have right now. And if you have a really urgent need to get an evaluation done, we do have some preferred partners and providers that we are partnered with in the community that sometimes hold some slots for families that we refer to them, or we're able to get them in a little bit quicker. So I always encourage people to reach out to us. But Marla, can we talk a little bit about that evaluation process for the elementary age child? Is that comprehensive evaluation process valuable for a child where we're suspecting ADHD, or at that age, does it cause too much stress, and kind of like where's the value in putting your child through that process if you're suspecting some of this?
Sure. Again, good question. You know, it really just depends on what your concerns are and what your, what you feel like the needs are for your child. Some families will decide if, the issue really isn't grade level performance, they're not having concerns about reading or math or language, right? It's just kind of these specific more attention. They may not choose to do a psychoeducational evaluation. They may choose to do an evaluation that just looks at, cognitive functioning and executive functions and things like that. I've tested a lot of kids, and they don't always love it. It's a long day. They come in and, we make it fun and we have snacks and all that other stuff. So it's a long day, but typically the process, is an appointment with parents. And this is generally true across providers, whether you're in a hospital system or with a private practice or with an organization like Rose. Typically there's a meeting with parents and provider. And so kiddo is sometimes involved in that, sometimes not. And then you have the testing time, which is anywhere from 2 to 4 hours, depending on the areas you're going to look at. And then you have kind of that final appointment where there's like feedback and results that you talk about. So, it's an investment of time, and depending on the route you go, insurance is obviously different for everyone. So it's just a different investment of time and resources based on your certain situation. But it's, other than the wait list, the experience itself is not a ton of time. It's more than one doctor's appointment for a half an hour, of course. But as far as, being too much for a kiddo, I think that really is just based on what your concerns are, and what you're looking to find out about kiddo and how they're doing. So
I'm looking at this question in the chat, and I actually read it more as standardized testing in the school, like MAP testing, and stuff like that. Is that standardized testing going to be valuable for kids with ADHD? And I'm reading this question as, is that data going to be accurate enough about their skills, or is the stress not worth it for those school-based standardized tests?
That's a distinction, because, school standardized testing sometimes is a good benchmark for how kiddo is doing. If kiddo goes in and sits down and thoughtfully takes the test, then sometimes it's like, okay, yeah, now we know how they're doing in math. But like Meghan highlighted earlier, parents, you're not in control of that environment. I can speak personally and professionally to the reality that sometimes kids go into these MAP tests, and especially now that they're computerized. I had that point in time, I think it was third grader, tell me that they were excited that they were the first ones done, and they just clicked every question as quickly as they could. So in that situation, obviously, his results weren't a really good reflection of his skills in those domains. And so when you're looking at what you need to know, what information do you have, obviously an evaluation with an individual provider, that one provider is sitting with your one kiddo in a controlled environment that is, relatively free of distraction. And they're going to be able to make sure they're getting accurate information out of kiddo. They're going to be able to tell you if they rushed through or if they thoughtfully answered questions or what their answer style was. So I would say sometimes you get two different sets of information from, school taken standardized testing versus a specific evaluation with a provider.
Well, and I think it's different types of information, right? So a standardized test for a student with ADHD, like the example you mentioned, Marla, where your student was just so excited that they clicked all the buttons because they're on a computer. It may not be an accurate assessment of the student's academic skills, but if a student is pursuing treatment for ADHD, it could be one indicator of potentially how that treatment is affecting those test results too. If they're performing completely differently, drastically differently once they're on a medication, or they've been in individual therapy, or with an accommodation like doing it in a separate room so they're not seeing all the other students and how fast they're doing it. It could be a piece of the puzzle for that pre-post how is treatment working data point.
Agreed. Or doing it on paper, which you can request.
So then comes the search for families on how do I find someone in the community to be a provider for me? So specifically for diagnostic evaluation, what are some questions that families can ask when they're calling around to providers to ensure that, number one, the provider knows how to assess for ADHD and has expertise in that, but then two, the topic today is girls with ADHD. How do we know that that provider really understands the nuances of how it shows up for girls? It seems like for some families, they're looking around at this and there is a lot of focus on the boys with ADHD.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's where a lot of our research has been. When you look at a lot of the sample sizes for our research, and it's like 80% of the sample was boys. So obviously, the information you get from that research is going to be a little bit imbalanced from that regard. I think it's good to know what are your needs and what are you looking for your child. And so if you are on the phone with a provider or a system and you're asking, how do you view differences between ADHD presentation in boys and girls? If they can't answer your question kind of in line with what you've heard today and things like that, that might be an indicator that they may be really well versed in ADHD overall, but maybe not really a great understanding of that specific difference in presentation between boys and girls. And so I think just asking direct questions and just kind of waiting to see what their answers are. It really, again, is individual. If your, insurance will sometimes do a better job at covering evaluations that do not include the educational piece. And so if a family is relying on insurance to cover an evaluation, because they are, again, it's an investment of resources, of time and money, you can look through your hospital systems, you can look through, and they'll provide an evaluation that they're confident will be covered by your insurance because that's what the system has kind of approved the battery to be. So that can be one place to go. Again, wait times, you just got to call and ask. It's, I think, Nancy hit it on the head. Sometimes it's a couple months. I know people who are told 18 months. So it can be really, really tough and frustrating because obviously even now it's January, a 3-month wait for an evaluation, you're looking at next school year before you get, really changes made. So I would say if you have questions, hop on the phone, kind of dedicate a chunk of time to calling a few places, calling a few private practices, and seeing what you can find. And Gross has a great we have a great system here, and also a great system to helping families figure out what's going on in their community too.
For not necessarily the evaluation piece, but possibly the treatment piece, there are also websites out there, like I know Psychology Today does this, where you could go on their website, and if you're looking for a therapist, you can filter by areas of expertise. So that could be one option, as well as going to a resource like that and filtering for specifically ADHD in girls and women.
I have some more questions around treatment and finding those resources, Meghan. I'd love to ask you. Number one is, are there suggestions that we at Groves have, or that you as an individual provider have, around where are good ADHD coaches, where are good executive function coaches? How, if I'm a person who doesn't live in a densely populated area, how do I even go about trying to find those types of providers?
More and more providers are providing services online. So it is still an option to find good providers, even if you're living in a more rural area and the provider is not located where you are located. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. Organizations like CHAD, I know we keep talking about it, but it's really good. Providers can sign up to be a part of their network. And so you can actually search providers on their website for your region, just like you can with those parent support groups. So that could be a good place to start. I also really encourage families to contact Groves via phone. Go to our website, hit our contact us button, put in your name, and then schedule a call with one of our family navigators. They are talking to families all day, every day, and they have so many resources in the community that we have visited. We've gone and met the providers, we've seen their clinics. And so we have a lot of different places that we can help families navigate to based on their needs. And again, that phone call will just start with what's happening with your student. And if we don't have the resources here at Groves to support, we do keep a really robust referral network, and it will definitely give recommendations for somewhere else that can support your student.
When you talked a little bit about, Meghan, here are some of the different treatment options, the things that you can shift for your student, the accommodations that you can put in place. One of the questions that we have is, okay, we have a child with ADHD. Do we see improvement with occupational therapy? Is it beneficial for these students? Is it not? Is it case by case? Can you talk a little bit about the blend of occupational therapy in there?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely going to be student dependent. So for instance, if your student is having a lot of symptoms of needing a lot of movement, hyperactivity, impulsivity, maybe an occupational therapist can help with something like a sensory diet in order to get that, either that input or that output, to be able to re-regulate and focus again. Occupational therapists can work on self-regulation skills. Sometimes they work on social skills. So it's going to completely depend on the symptoms you're seeing with your student. Sometimes motor coordination is part of OT. So I would say the short answer is yes, that could be a piece of the puzzle, but it's not necessarily going to be a piece of the puzzle for every student who has ADHD.
Thank you. We have time for a couple more questions, and there's a couple more that I'd love to ask. Marla, this is a great question for you. Can you talk a little bit about the diagnosis of anxiety and ADHD, and is there ever a concern that there's a misdiagnosis of anxiety when really it's ADHD?
Yes. Yes, I would say I see that, we see that often. And I hit on it a little bit when I was talking about some of the symptoms, and it is like a braid, and the symptoms, some really do overlap. And so when you're having an evaluation, you want to make sure you unbraid those things. So if there is anxiety, we want to know, is the anxiety, generalized? So is it about, health and safety and kind of about a lot of different things? Or is the anxiety pretty specific to, I got 5 minutes left in class and then I realized I didn't hear anything the teacher said. I'm anxious because I know homework is coming and I have to sit down and do homework. Anxiety is related to, kid only displays anxiety on Sunday night before the school week starts, or, anxiety kind of shows up before a test. So when I'm doing an evaluation, I want to look at, what are the symptoms of the anxiety? When is it showing up? Can we identify rhythms or patterns to that anxiety? And can we identify some patterns of what's causing the anxiety? Are there cases where a diagnosis of anxiety doesn't better explain the symptoms, but they are existing together, they're comorbid? Absolutely, but I think it's really important to really unbraid that so that okay, which of these symptoms are really ADHD that's not untreated, and then which of these symptoms are anxiety in and of itself. So, but that's especially in girls, it is often misdiagnosed, and a lot of girls are kind of grown up and they're told things like, oh, you're just anxious, or you need to, you just need to calm down, or whatever, and it really is undiagnosed ADHD. So that definitely happens.
Who can the family reach out to help untie that braid or tie it together, or understand that? Is it starting with the pediatrician, starting with this, who do they reach out to figure that out?
That should all be a part of an evaluation that you have. If it's any provider worth their salt is going to be able to walk you through that, because it's a really important piece of the puzzle to figure out. So, primary care, depending on your provider, that may not be their area of expertise, right? Like they serve their patients on a different level. And so if you are meeting with a psychologist and you're talking with them about the symptoms, again, the same thing you do to make sure they're well-versed in ADHD with girls, you want to make sure they're well-versed to differentiate between anxiety, PTSD, and some of these other symptoms that might be going on. And those are things that you can ask them about, ask them their approach and ask them how they go about figuring those things out. And you want to make sure they have an answer that you're comfortable with.
I think this is a little bit this question is pulling at that same thread. So if a family has a psychological evaluation scheduled for next week, rather than a neuropsych evaluation. So thinking back to that slide you showed us with all the different types of evaluations, how can we ensure as a family that we're really going to get what the family wants in truly assessing that braid of ADHD? What might be a question that they could call up to the place where they have it scheduled to say, okay, I want to make sure we're doing X, Y, Z?
Great question. Call the provider, and you can specifically ask, what measures do you plan on, what do you plan on looking into? Are you going to do cognitive work? Are you going to do mood? What are you going to look at as a part of your evaluation? You can specifically ask what measures they will use to reach a diagnosis or not. So I would ask, and then you can ask what, it's like your kid is a house, right? And as a provider, we want to make sure they're walking around the whole house, looking in all the windows, right? It's the same house, but you want to look in as many windows as you can to get the best picture possible. It's impossible to look through every window, but you want to ask the questions to say, hey, what are you going to look into to help reach a diagnosis or confidently not diagnose? And again, they should have clear answers. They should be able to specifically tell you, we're going to look at their overall cognitive functioning, that we're going to look at mood, we're going to interview or have a questionnaire for a teacher. They should have a specific answer. Or we're going to look at memory and processing speed. So I would say ask the question and they should have an answer for you.
Are there like a checklist of a quick, could you rattle off things that should definitely be included or things that are definitely red flags if a provider is saying they're going to do that and you shouldn't do that? Are there things that parents can specifically look out for that a provider would be saying, we're doing this?
Yeah. And again, not to belabor, but Chad has great resources for parents. So questions to ask as you go into a diagnostic evaluation. I can't say specifically what, a provider might think should or shouldn't be. What I will say is this, I don't love when I have, people come in and they have one questionnaire that a parent filled out, and then that was the basis of their diagnosis. Okay, so, we are, in all of our years of training, we're all hammered into our heads as psychologists, is you never base a diagnosis on one measure or one test. And so I think keeping that in mind maybe is a better measure of am I going to look in, are we looking into several windows? this house here to make sure that our view is accurate. So yeah, I don't have a list of like specific measures that I think have to be used, but I think as long as there are multiple and that we're making sure that we can say, oh, okay, it's not cognitive functioning, because you can imagine if I take a kiddo through testing and their IQ is, you know, below average, that would be a good explanation for why they may be having a hard time following in class. And it may be that versus ADHD. So I want to make sure I get an answer to that question. So yeah, I think it should just make sure there's multiple domains that are being assessed.
Great, thank you. There's one more question that I have to ask just to finish this up. So someone give me a 20-second answer to this question. This question got a couple hearts and laughs on it. Can we help a parent with their 7-year-old to get dressed in the morning without getting into that negative back and forth? And you get bonus points if this family can get to school on time. So what's our 20-second piece of advice for this parent as we end our webinar today? Who would like to take that one?
I can take it. My 20-second advice would be give them instructions one step at a time. Have the routine be super repetitive and do it over and over and over again so that they can memorize it. Provide lots and lots of modeling, more modeling than you think you need to. Show them how to do it with them before they're ever expected to do it on their own. And work with a coach that can support this type of stuff on a regular basis. Your family setting up success at home for these types of routines, because that's going to be a common difficulty area for sure. But this is another important place to think about that 3-year time development gap, right? So a student who has ADHD who's 7, their executive functioning skills to do things independently, like plan my outfit, manage my time, gather all my supplies, all of those things, is going to be more like a 4-year-old. So think about what would you expect a 4-year-old to be able to do independently in their morning routine? And are your expectations for your 7-year-old with ADHD aligning with that? Are your expectations realistic for where your kid is at developmentally?
There's so many good conversation happening in the chat amongst parents. I love that. I wish we were all in a room together and we could break out into tables. Thank you all. We're 3 minutes past. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, DeeDee and Marla. We really appreciate having everyone here today. Our team will send a follow-up email to all of you that were here today with the slides in it that have the resources. Please reach out to us with questions, and we hope to see you at our next GLO Education series, and have a wonderful afternoon. Bye, everybody.